So I came across an article this week about a certain billionaire who will remain nameless, but needless to say, you would all recognize the name if I said it. And the reason that he was in the news is because that he was having a yacht being built in the city of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And this yacht is going to be 417 feet long and 130 feet tall. And the cost of this yacht is $500 million for one boat. Now, as unfathomable as that number may seem, that's actually not the newsworthy part of this story. The reason that this was in the news was because this individual had to persuade the city of Rotterdam to disassemble a historic bridge that was blocking his boat to get out to sea. And this bridge has been there for hundreds of years and is actually a national landmark. And this man had enough influence that he was able to convince the city to tear apart this bridge because his boat was too tall, because the masts were 130 feet tall to get it through. Now, when we contrast that with some other stories about this particular individual and the company that made him his billions of dollars, we've seen over the last several years, this particular company has been sued several times and is currently in the middle of several lawsuits for unsafe working conditions. In fact, the people that work in these warehouses, according to OSHA, have 3 times the amount of workplace injuries compared to other warehouses. There's been several people that have gone public about being fired just because they were talking about unionizing. Many of his employees have complained about very long hours with little pay. And there have also been several cases where it has been confirmed that the delivery drivers for this particular company were caught in public urinating and defecating in plastic bottles inside of their trucks because their schedules were so tight that they didn't have time to take a bathroom break because they were being pushed that hard. And so there are certainly a segment in our population, which we'll call a loud minority, who think that everybody rich is evil, right? Eat the rich. We hear like some ridiculous stuff. And people have this mindset that in order to become wealthy or successful, you have to do it on the backs of other people. And that the only way to lift yourself up is to push other people down. And so we just associate being rich with being evil. And that is obviously nonsense. Right, I'm assuming, right, most Christians, especially in rural areas, like here, tend to be on the opposite end of that spectrum if we were to apply this to politics. But we have to recognize that there is a grain of truth that would cause people to hold that ideology. And so when we hear stories like this individual, which again, if some of you probably have already figured out in your head exactly who I'm talking about, but my purpose here is not to tear down a certain person or a certain company, no matter how many of us use this person's services. But the point is to talk, right, that, again, there's a grain of truth to this idea that, right, some people acquire wealth by oppressing and taking advantage of other people. And the Bible actually has quite a lot to say about that. So we're going to be in James chapter 5. We've made it to the last chapter of the book of James. And so we've got 2 more weeks after this to finish up the series, and that'll take us right into Easter, where we're going to start a new series on the resurrection coming out of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But the subtitle of this series, right, kind of one of the underlying themes that runs through all of this is faith at work. And we've talked a lot about how if you claim to be a follower of Jesus and you claim to have a relationship with God, then that has to work its way out in the way that we live our lives. And what we're going to see today is that if you have if the view that we have of God is also going to work its way out in the view that we have of money, in the way that we view and handle our money. So we're going to read verses 1 through 6 today, but we're going to start off just with 1, 2, and 3. So it says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire." Those are not exactly the verses that we print on t-shirts, are they? Right? That sounds kind of rough. Right? James obviously is not speaking too highly of rich people. But also, if you remember, I've said this multiple times, that almost nothing James is saying in this entire book is original to him. Just about all of it is being taken from either the book of Proverbs or Jesus in the Sermon specifically on the Sermon on the Mount, which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense. Of course, he's going to be quoting his brother because he would have been around him for a lot of that. But compare verses 1 through 3 with what Jesus says in Matthew 6:19 through 21, when he says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your hearts will be also." Right, so it's pretty easy to see what James's source material is for getting these ideas. We can even go to Matthew 19:23 and 24. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I will tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And so when you read both these passages in Matthew and what James writes, you may start to get the opinion that this family really doesn't like rich people. And again, right, you've probably met some people like that whether it's out of spite or something, right, they just think that anybody that's successful must be evil. I don't think that's what James or Jesus is trying to communicate. In fact, he's going to give a couple different kind of qualifiers as to what he means by the rich. And right, because God is not anti-wealth. There's plenty of examples of God using wealthy people throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, we have people like Abraham, Job, David. Solomon was the wealthiest man alive, although it didn't end up too well for him. In the New Testament, we have people like Barnabas, Lydia, Zacchaeus, Joseph of Arimathea. These were all people that had great wealth and great success that were used by God. So James is not talking about just people that have money. What he's talking about are people that love their money. And there's a big distinction. And so, right, he even talks about in the verses 2 and 3, right, when he says, your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten, right, and your gold and silver have corroded, right? And he's pointing out that there's no point in loving money and loving things that money can buy, because all of those things are temporary. Right? Think about it. All the nice things that you can have in life. What are those things going to be in 10, 20, 30 years? You go buy your dream car. Well, we live in upstate New York where they put salt on the road, so that car is going to rust out pretty soon. And then you're going to have to buy another one. You build your dream house. Well, eventually, right, the foundation's going to crack. Termites are going to get to it. Your kids are going to put holes in the walls, right? Eventually, the house is going to fall over. And even if you have nice things that do outlive you, when you die, you don't get to take any of it with you, right? So there's no point in loving money. So again, God is not just anti-wealth, right? He's anti-love of money. And so there's three specific we'll call them qualifiers as to who fits into this category that James calls the rich that are going to be judged by God, according to verse 3, right? These will be evidence against you, and your flesh will eat your flesh like fire. So the first one is going to come in the second half of verse 3 on the next slide, where it says, you have laid up treasure in the last days. You have laid up treasure. If you have a King James version of the Bible, it might say you have heaped up treasure. I think I like the New International Version, I think, best communicates what James is trying to say when it says you have hoarded treasure in the last day. And I think really what he's talking about here in this sentence is talking about hoarding. So we have to realize there's a difference between hoarding and saving. Right? So saving is setting aside money to be used at a later point for a specific purpose. So you can have just a rainy day fund or an emergency fund in case something goes wrong and you have money set aside for that. You could be saving up to go on a vacation. You can be saving up to send your kids to college, to buy your dream home. You can be saving up for retirement. All of those things are good, wise things. Right? It is a good thing to have savings. Proverbs 13 says that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Right? That requires that you have to have some money set aside and invested into things in order to do that. That is a wise thing to do. But hoarding is a little bit different. Hoarding is keeping things so that other people can't have them. And that's driven by this mindset of scarcity. As if there's only so much, and so I've got to get mine before everybody else takes some and there's none left for me. Right? That's one of the driving mindsets behind hoarding. You think in 2020 with the great toilet paper shortage. Remember all that? You got these idiots going to like Walmart and all these stores and buying up all of the toilet paper they could find because they didn't want to run out. They didn't want anybody else to get it before them. That's hoarding. You know what the really dumb thing about those people is? The things they didn't have in their shopping carts? Food. You realize if you don't have food, you don't need toilet paper? It's just how it works. No sense in having 5 years worth of toilet paper if you're not going to be using the bathroom. Anyway. Right, so hoarding it's an obsession. Anybody ever watch the show Hoarders? Right, you get these, it's kind of disturbing, but you have these people that have, right, their houses are just so full of things, they literally can't even walk into certain rooms in their house because it's so full of things that they've just collected for themselves. And I found the really interesting thing about that show is that they would send in a team of people to clean out all of their stuff, usually in hazmat suits, but then they'd also send in a psychiatrist. Because there's a psychological problem that is driving these people to do this. And so even if you don't like have buckets of your own urine stored up in your house, like some of these people on the show would do, you laugh, but I have actually seen houses with that in there. Right, so even if you're not that bad, right, the idea of hoarding money, there's a psychological, it's an obsession. There's an effect going behind this, because every time you put your money away, you get like a little dopamine hit in your brain, right? It feels good, and that feeling becomes addictive, and so you want more and more and more, right? So it's driven by an obsession, and it's also driven by an ideology that has money as an end goal in itself, right? So money is a tool. And you can use that tool to accomplish whatever purpose you want. And that purpose might be good or bad. But when you view money as an end to itself, you're always going to be in trouble. Because you will never have enough money to satisfy you. Money itself cannot make you happy. Right? Again, you might feel that little feeling of happiness when you get more. But then that just constantly leaves you craving more, and it turns into an addiction in itself, right? And that's what hoarding does, right? You can't have money as the end goal in itself, right? Money must be viewed as a means to reach something else, which as Christians should be glorifying God. And so if you feel like this is you, which by the way, this isn't just about rich people. I know a lot of poor people that fall into this category as well. They're just not as good with money, but the desire is the same, right? They're constant. If you lay up at night thinking about how can I get more money, right? There's only one cure for that, and that is to give generously. I came across an article in Christianity Today that said, according to Nonprofit Source, which is a group that pulls this stuff, it says that only 5% of church members give regularly. Households that make more than $75,000 are the least charitable, right? So that idea that, oh, well, if I make more money, then I'll give, that doesn't work out. That's the terrible mindset to have. Nationwide, Christians today give 2.5% of their income. For comparison, during the Great Depression, that number was 3.3%. Let that sink in. We live in the richest society in the world, and I know the last couple of years have been hard and things have been all over the place. But during the Great Depression, people gave more money than we do today. Right? So we have to view our money as a means on how we can help other people. Which means we have to be willing to give some of it away. Right? And so tithing is one way to do that. Now, a lot of people get really surprised when I say, and don't believe me, that nowhere in the New Testament does it ever command Christians to tithe. And a tithe, by definition, is 10%. That's something that's carried over that we see in the Old Testament. But what is commanded of us in the New Testament is to give generously and to give sacrificially. So if you are new to this and you've never given before and you think 10% sounds way too much, try 5. Take that step of faith and see, right? And ultimately it comes to, right, there is no set amount that Christians have to give, right? If you decide you want to become a member of this church, I promise you at no point in that process will I ever ask you to disclose your annual income so we can check that with what your giving is. There are churches that do that. If you ever see a church that does that, run away really fast. Right? So I'm not going to do that. But you need to determine between you and God. You need to sit down with him and just really start praying really hard. God, how much do you want me to give? And if you and God settle on 5%, great. If you settle on 8%, great. If you want to give 20%, great. That's between you and God. But we need to be giving generously. And it's more about the spirit of how we're giving. And I also know that people get really weirded out whenever preachers talk about giving, right? I can assure you that if you give more, it doesn't go directly to me, right? It goes to the, like part of the money that comes does go to my salary, which again, I've said before, you guys get to determine if you're a member of the church. Right? But it also goes to other ministries and things like that. And if you don't want to give to the church, then give somewhere else. There are plenty of other good ministries. One that I forgot to mention earlier, so I'll do it now. This is the last week for the Cradle fundraiser for the Options Care Center. That Cradle is going to be going away this week, so this is your last opportunity to do that, right? That's a great organization that is doing great things. You can give to Family Life Network, whatever. You can just have money set aside and look for individuals or in families that are in need and give to them directly. But the point is that as Christians, the only way to break this hold that money can have on us is to have a generous spirit and to look for ways that we can use our money to help other people, right? Having more money is not the goal. But if having more money allows us to help more people, great. Let's keep doing that. The next one is found in verse 4. We move on to that one. It says, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." Right? So if the first one, right, the first kind of category is hoarding, the second one is fraud or corruption. So greed and theft. right? And we have to realize that these are sins that any one of us are capable of falling into. And the more we focus our attention on money itself, the more likely we are to give into these temptations. I was going to say that the more money we have, the more likely we are to give into these temptations. But that's not necessarily true, because there's a lot of very wealthy people. Like I think it was the owner of Caterpillar, the company that makes the tractors and all that stuff. He gives 90% of his income to charity, right? So just having more money doesn't automatically make you evil. But the more we focus on money, the more likely we are to fall into these traps. When I read this and it talked about he says, the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. The first thing that popped into my mind when I read that was Exodus chapter 1. And in Exodus chapter 1, we see the Israelites are slaves in Egypt. And it said that Pharaoh increased their workload and was basically using them as free labor and running them into the ground. And so they cried out to God, and God heard them. And what did he do? He sent 10 plagues against Pharaoh. I don't know about you, but I don't ever want to be put into the same category as Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. Right? So what it comes down to is we can use people as a means to reach wealth, or we can use our wealth as a means to reach people. And so in the Old Testament, we see there's actually several laws that were set up to protect people from this kind of abuse and fraud that is talked about here in verse 4. We see in Deuteronomy 24 that workers are to be paid the same day that they worked. And it said specifically because they depend on that daily to get their food. Deuteronomy 15, all debts are canceled every 7 years. Doesn't that sound nice? Right? Every 7 years, it just goes back, your debt goes back to zero. Well, there's a flip side to that. You also have to realize that nobody's going to give you a 15 or 30-year loan if it has to be paid back every 7 years. So your chances of getting loans go down, but they won't be held over you for the rest of your life. Exodus 15 forbids the Jews from charging interest to their neighbors if they give them a loan, right? They could charge people that weren't Israelites interest, but they can't charge the brothers and sisters interests, right? Which means when you give some money to somebody, you're getting that amount back, no more. In Leviticus 19 says that they were supposed to leave the leftover crops for the poor, right? So when you go through and collect everything for harvest, you're not to go back a second time and make sure you got every little bit, because that was left for the poor people to come and help themselves to. And so all of these would fall under the category of what we'd call kind of like a safety net, or like social programs. And I know there's a lot of discussion today in our society as to how much of these social programs we should have and how much we should regulate business. And if you're like myself, that you think it should probably be much less, we should have very few regulations. However, if you think the amount of business or government regulations and social nets should be zero, God would disagree, right? There is supposed to be something to protect the most vulnerable in societies. And we can sit here all day and argue about what the right amount of regulations and all this stuff are, but we also realize that we have very little control over what our government does, but we have a lot of control over what we do, right? And so the answer to this is that we're supposed to do justice, right? We're supposed to treat people justly, meaning treat them what they deserve, right? So if you hire somebody, are you paying them what you agreed when you agreed? Right? If you run a business, are you treating your employees fairly? When you go out to eat, are you automatically looking for things to complain about so you can get your food discounted or free? I worked in restaurants for many years. I've seen that way too many times, which, by the way, I'll also add on there. A tip is 20%. If you can't afford to tip, you can't afford to go out to eat, stay home and cook your own food. I'm not apologizing for that. Servers in New York State make $5 an hour, right? Right. So treating them justly is tipping them according to their service. Right. And there's so many aspects in life that, right, are you treating people fairly? Think of the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. When you add money into that equation, it becomes really obvious how we want to be treated, right? And so we need to extend the same to other people, right? So we need to deal justly. We need to pay, right? If you take out a loan, are you paying it back in the amount and the time that was agreed upon? That's doing justly. The third one is found in verse 5 and 6. It says, "You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned in murder the righteous person. He does not resist you." Well, the first time I read verse 6, and I'm like, wait a minute, why wouldn't he resist you? And then I realized the rest of the verse, oh, you murdered him. He's dead. He can't resist you. But when you look at the second half of verse 5, it says, "You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter." Right? It just makes me think of like a pig, although I'm sure that's not the example that James would have had because he was Jewish and they didn't eat pigs, but I like pigs. Right? And so like the last few weeks of a pig's life, you just start stuffing it to get it as big as possible so that way you have more food when you go to roast it or when you go to slaughter it and cook it. And in the same way, right, luxury and self-indulgence is basically fattening ourselves up for when we burn in hell. I don't know, maybe hell's going to be like one of those like giant pit roasts where somebody's just sitting there turning it. I don't know. I'll stop. I'll back away from that one. Right, but again, luxury and self-indulgence are what he says are fattening our hearts, right? And those two things are a clear giveaway that we love things and we love money more than we love people. In 1 Timothy 6:17, Paul instructs Timothy, he says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides for us with everything to enjoy." Who richly provides for us with everything to enjoy. Right? Everything that we need to be happy and be satisfied in this life can be found in God alone. Which means that, again, the only way to fight against this idea of this self-indulgence of constantly spoiling ourselves and buying more things for ourselves is to live humbly. It's to live a simple, humble life. Which means that we have to live below our means. The best way that I can teach about money, something that I stole directly from Andy Stanley, so I'll give him credit, although I'm pretty sure he didn't come up with it. He probably stole it from somebody else who stole it from somebody else. But it's quite simple. It's give, save, live, in that order. Right? So if you figure out, right, all of your income, everything that you make, all of your side jobs, stimulus checks, because I don't know, they're still coming out, right? You take everything that you have coming in and you say, this is how much money I have to work with. And so first thing I'm going to do, right, I'm not going to wait till I'm done, because if you wait to see what you have left over, then you're not going to have anything. But first, I'm going to give. Right? Like I said, you need to figure out between you and God, how much do you want to give, whether it's to church or other charities or to other people. And then you take that out first. And then the second thing you need to do is you need to figure out how much do I want to set aside for later. So say you want to give 10%, and then you want to save another 10%. And that leaves you with 80% of your income to live with. Again, you can make the numbers whatever you want them to be. But from there on, you decide, this is how much money I have. If whatever I want doesn't fit into this amount, I don't need it. And so, right, so often we think, well, I have to have this, I have to have that. Why? Because you want to impress other people? To quote Dave Ramsey, he says, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't know. Why do we care about the opinions of the world? Those people are going to hell. Their opinions don't matter. The only opinion that matters of you is God. And God loves you. God says you're enough. And God has promised that he will give you everything that you need and that all the satisfaction that you could ever want will be found in him. Right? And so when we view our money through that lens, now all of a sudden it becomes pretty simple, right? I don't need all of these fancy things. I don't need to buy a new car. I don't need to have a $500,000 house, right? I can live simply. I know for me personally, the idea of just like pulling off the grid and just like having a little homestead is sounding more and more appealing. And then I realized that most of you are almost there already in this church, apparently. I also want to add a little qualifier onto that we need to be really careful not to judge other people. Because if you're like me, right, and you don't make a lot of money, I know I accepted when I became a pastor that I'm never going to be rich. And I'm okay with that. But it becomes very easy to look at somebody that has more money than you and just assume that their heart is in the wrong place. Right? And so somebody goes out and buys themselves a brand new Corvette. Be like, wow, how many orphans in Haiti could they have fed with that $75,000 they just dropped on a car? You don't know where their heart is. Maybe they are self-indulging, maybe they are hoarding, maybe they're not, right? But the money, we're allowed to have nice things. It's okay to treat yourself every once in a while if it's in proportion with how much you're giving to other people, right? It's not about amount, it's about where your heart is at. And so we need to be very careful not to judge someone who has more than us and just automatically assume that their heart's in the wrong place. Because maybe they spent $75,000 on a sports car, but at the same time, they also wrote a check for $150,000 to some charity. You don't know where their heart is at, so be very careful judging that. But to wrap this up here, in Hebrews 13:5, it says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Again, God is not against people having money. He's against people loving money. And when we love money, it ends up showing up in exactly what we saw here before. It shows up in hoarding, and fraud, and self-indulgence. And the more we love money, the more we are likely to fall into those sins. And so we can either be lovers of money, or we can be lovers of people. Remember when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? His answer is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. But then he went on to say, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there's a direct correlation between those two things. If you love God, you will love other people. Again, when we apply money to this idea, right, instead of fraud and self-indulgence and hoarding, we will end up giving generously, doing justly, and living humbly. If you focus on those three things, that is how we overcome this temptation to love money, right? When our hearts are taken off of money and things and onto other people, because those people are the image of God and they deserve to be loved and they deserve to be shown the gospel, then our lives will be marked by these three things. We will become generous. We will become just and treat people fairly, and our lives will become humble. And we won't make it about having nice things. Again, having nice things is not the issue, but it's where is your heart at, right? So give generously, do justly, and live humbly. Now this time we're going to change things up and we're going to take part in the Lord's Supper. So I'm going to ask Matt and Tim